They took the house. They took the truck payment. They took her name off every account it had ever been on. They left her a cellar sealed since 1948 and called it nothing. Gary Kessler stood at a closing table in Elkton. He told the buyer his mother's old farmhouse was worthless. $400 maybe, for the tin roof as scrap. He said it into his phone. His mother was packing a suitcase 11 feet away. He did not lower his voice. And then she started digging. Let me take you back 6 weeks. To the Tuesday, a sheriff's deputy drove up Route 9. 2 cardboard boxes on his back seat. The sheriff's deputy set 2 cardboard boxes on Dorothy Kessler's porch. Mom, you have until 5 o'clock. Dorothy was 75 years old. She had lived in the house on Larkspur Street for 41 years. She had taught 2nd grade at Piney Fork Elementary. 30 years of it. Long enough to know the sound of a child trying not to cry. She heard that sound now, coming out of her own throat. She pressed her lips together. It stopped. 5 o'clock, she said. All right. The deputy was a young man named Cole Ferris. He looked like he wanted to apologise for existing. I'm sorry, Ma'am. It's a done sale. Papers filed. I understand, Dorothy said. Would you like coffee before you drive back down the mountain? He said no, thank you, ma'am. Then he left. Dorothy stood on the porch a minute. She looked at the dogwood her husband Robert had planted the year they moved in. Then she went inside and started packing. Grief was not going to put a roof over her head by 5 o'clock. She called her son first. Not to beg. She had never once begged Gary for anything. Not in 51 years. She was not about to start now. Mom, Gary said when he picked up. She could hear a golf course behind him. That flat quiet of a fairway. Mum, I was going to call you today. You sold my house, Gary. It wasn't your house, Mum. Your name came off the deed 6 years ago. You signed it. For the tax thing. Remember? She remembered. A lawyer's office, fluorescent lights. A stack of papers 3 inches thick. Gary behind her chair. It's just a formality, Mum. It protects you if something happens to me. She remembered trusting her only child. That was the whole shape of what a mother did. I remember, she said. It's just a house, Mum. You'll be fine at Sunset Manor. I already put the deposit down. Sunset Manor. An assisted living facility off the interstate. $3,800 a month. Dorothy knew the number because she had priced it herself, 2 years back, quietly, in case the day ever came. She had not expected her son to make that decision for her. I won't be going to Sunset Manor, she said. Mom, come on. Where else would you go? I have somewhere, Dorothy said. She did not say where. Some things a woman keeps for herself. She hung up and finished packing. 2 suitcases. Her spiral notebooks. 41 years of them. A ledger she had kept since she was a girl, helping her father with the dairy accounts. Every dollar in her own small hand. That was how you kept from being lied to. You wrote the number down. You kept the paper. Her husband Robert's toolbox, because a woman alone needed tools more than china. A framed photograph of her father, Walter Kessler, standing in front of a barn that burned down 30 years ago. She did not cry. She'd already cried plenty. Alone at night in the 2 weeks since she found out. Today she had somewhere to be by 5 o'clock. Crying was not on the schedule. The farmhouse at the end of Hollow Creek Road had belonged to her father. It had stood empty 11 years since Walter died. Nobody in the family wanted it. The roof had a hole in the north corner. The porch sagged. The well pump had not run since the Clinton administration. Gary called it a pile of nothing. He'd said so once at Thanksgiving, laughing. Maybe $400 for the tin roof. If somebody wanted scrap. Dorothy had never sold it. It was the one thing in her name Gary had never gotten near. It came to her outright, in her father's will. No tax formality. No signature Gary had ever talked her into. She drove there now with 2 suitcases and a toolbox. Up 3 miles of gravel, past the last paved stretch. She parked in front of the house where she had grown up, where her father taught her to read a ledger before she could read a chapter book. She carried the suitcases up the porch steps herself. The porch groaned. The front door stuck. Inside, the air smelled of coal dust and old wood smoke. A smell she remembered from being 7 years old. Small enough to hide behind the wood stove during thunderstorms. She set the suitcases in the front room. She looked at the water stains on the ceiling, the mouse droppings along the baseboard. She thought, well, this one is mine. Nobody can take this one with a phone call from a golf course. 3 days later, she was on the roof. Ed Tanner lived a half mile down the road. He had known Dorothy since she was a girl, bringing him eggs from the Kessler henhouse. He drove up and found her on a ladder, a bundle of shingles under one arm, a hammer in her belt. "Dorothy Kessler," he said, "get down off that roof before you break your fool neck." "I taught second grade 30 years, Ed," she said, not stopping. "I can nail a shingle. Let me call your boy." "You will not," Dorothy said, flat and final. Ed closed his mouth. She measured the gap in the roofline, a tape from Robert's toolbox. She marked it in pencil. She cut the shingle clean on the first pass, the kind of clean cut that comes from a person who has watched real work done for 75 years, and paid attention the whole time. Ed stood at the bottom of the ladder a while. He handed up nails when she asked. "You know," he said eventually, "surveyors were out here Tuesday. Past your daddy's old fence line, the back 40. Orange stakes clean down to the creek." Dorothy stopped hammering. Surveyors, younger fella, county plates on the truck. Didn't say who for. She thought about that the rest of the afternoon. One nail after another, steady and even. Her father had always kept that back 40 separate. She remembered him saying it more than once when she was a girl, carrying feed buckets across it. The house is for living in, the land is for keeping. She never understood what he meant. She'd assumed it was one of those things old farmers said, wise sounding and empty. She was beginning to wonder if it had meant something after all. That evening she built a fire in the wood stove, the same one she had hidden behind as a child. She sat with her spiral notebook. She wrote down what she knew for certain. The house and 2 acres had come to her clean. No tax formality, no strings. The back 40, running down to the creek, she'd always assumed was part of the same parcel. She had never once looked at the actual deed. She wrote that down too, checked the deed. The next morning she drove into Elkton, to the county courthouse. She asked the clerk at the Recorder of Deeds office to see the file on the old Kessler place, Hollow Creek Road. The clerk was young and busy. She pulled a screen up. The parcel on record for Dorothy Kessler was 6 acres. The house and immediate grounds. The back 40 was not in Dorothy's name. It was not in anybody's name the system recognised clearly. Flagged for a title search. Pending. "Pending what?" Dorothy asked. The clerk shrugged. "Somebody filed a subdivision plat on it last month. Hollow Creek Estates. 11 lots." Dorothy Kessler stood very still in the Elkton courthouse. She held her spiral notebook. She thought about her son on a golf course, calling the old place worthless. She thanked the clerk. She walked back to her car. She sat behind the wheel a long moment before she started the engine. Whatever this was, it had begun long before Gary sold her house. It had begun, she suspected, with a man who welded a trunk shut in 1948. And never told a soul why. She drove home, to the farmhouse with the hole in the roof, to the cellar she had not been down into yet. For the first time in 6 weeks, Dorothy Kessler felt something other than grief. She felt curious. The cellar door was at the back of the kitchen, behind a pantry shelf that had collapsed years back and never been cleared. Dorothy spent the better part of a Saturday just getting to it, hauling out rotted wood, mouse-chewed boxes of canning jars nobody had touched since before her mother died. She was $63 into new supplies by then. A headlamp, $12. A pry bar, $18. Heavy gloves, $9. A box of contractor bags, $6. She wrote every figure in the spiral notebook. The way she always had. A woman who kept her own books never had to wonder where the money went. The cellar door itself was old wood, warped. A simple slide bolt her father must have oiled 100 times. It still moved, stiff but willing when she worked it loose. Stairs led down into dark. It smelled like river silt and cold stone. She stood at the top a long moment, 75 years old, alone in a house at the end of a gravel road, about to climb down into a hole in the ground nobody had used properly in a decade. She thought about calling Ed. She thought about her son, who would have told her not to be foolish. She went down anyway. The cellar was smaller than she remembered from childhood, the way rooms always are when you go back as an adult. Field stone walls, a dirt floor packed hard as concrete, wooden shelves along one wall, mostly collapsed, holding the ghost outlines of jars and tools long gone to rust. She swept it out over 3 days, a little each morning, before her knees complained too much to keep going. On the 4th day, moving the last of the collapsed shelving, her boot caught on something. It did not give the way dirt should give. She knelt down. She brushed at it with a gloved hand. She found a seam. Not a crack. A seam. Straight as a ruler. Running 4 feet, then turning a hard corner. Under the packed dirt was poured concrete. Old and grey, laid by somebody who wanted it flush with the floor around it, and mostly succeeded. Dorothy sat back on her heels. She looked at it a long moment. Well, she said out loud, to nobody. There you are. She called Ed Tanner that evening, not because she needed permission. 75 years had taught her that some discoveries are safer witnessed than made alone. You found a what? Ed said. A concrete slab, under the cellar floor, poured flush, like somebody wanted it hidden. Ed arrived the next morning with his own pry bar and headlamp. The two of them spent 4 hours chipping at the edge of the slab. It finally gave. Tilting up on a hinge Dorothy hadn't even noticed, revealing not more dirt but an iron door, rusted nearly solid, set into a frame of old brick. Lord, Ed said. He sat down hard on an overturned bucket. Your daddy built a room down here. He never said a word about it. Man built half this county. With his own 2 hands, Ed said. Never said a word about any of it. That was Walter Kessler for you. The iron door would not move. They worked at the hinges with penetrating oil. $4 at the hardware store. They worked the latch with the pry bar. Still it held. 76 years of rust fusing metal to metal. Ed suggested a torch. Dorothy suggested patience. And oil. And coming back the next day. Whatever was behind that door had waited 76 years. It could wait one more. That night she called Earl Voss. Earl was 82, the retired county surveyor. He had apprenticed under her father, back when Walter Kessler still ran surveys off the back of a mule. The county truck couldn't get up half the roads he needed. Earl kept his own set of the old plat maps in a shed behind his house. Out of some stubborn conviction that paper outlasted computers. Dorothy had known him her whole life. The way you know somebody who is simply always there at the edges of your father's world. Earl, she said, I need you to look at something, and I need you to bring your father's old maps of the Kessler place. All of them, if you've still got them. Dorothy Kessler, I heard about your house. I'm sorry, girl. I appreciate that, Earl. But I need to know what my father owned. All of it. Not what Gary thinks he owned. There was a pause on the line. The particular pause of a man who has spent his career reading land. He knew exactly what that question meant. I'll be up there Thursday, he said. Earl arrived Thursday morning. A truck older than Dorothy's marriage. A cardboard tube of rolled maps under one arm. A set of proper tools under the other. Tools that made short work of what Ed's penetrating oil had only softened. He worked the iron door with the patience of 60 years, coaxing stubborn things to move. Under an hour later it groaned. It shrieked. It swung inward on a hinge that had not turned since Truman was president. The 3 of them stood at the opening. Headlamps aimed into the dark. Inside was a room no bigger than a closet. Walls of the same fieldstone as the cellar above. Dry as a bone, despite the years. Whatever her father knew about building, he knew how to keep water out of a thing he wanted kept. And in the centre of the room sat a steel trunk. Not large, maybe 3 feet across, but heavy, riveted at the corners. Where a lock should have been, there was instead a seam of dull grey metal running the length of the lid. He welded it, Earl said quietly. Walter welded the lid shut. Dorothy knelt in front of it. She ran her gloved fingers along the weld. 76 years of dust settled off it under her touch. Stamped into the steel near one corner, faint but legible, were 3 letters and a number. WK 48. Walter Kessler, 1948, Ed said, reading it over her shoulder. Dorothy sat back on her heels in the dry stone room. She thought about a man who taught her to read a ledger before she could read a book, who told a little girl the house is for living in, the land is for keeping, who then went down into this cellar with a welding torch and sealed something shut so thoroughly it took 3 people and 76 years to get through the door in front of it. What's in it? Ed asked. I don't know, Dorothy said, but we're not cutting it open tonight. It's waited this long. Earl agreed, mostly because his knees had had enough of the cellar floor. The 3 of them climbed back up into the kitchen. Dorothy made coffee on the propane burner she'd bought for $11. They sat at her father's old kitchen table. Nobody talked for a while. They just let the fact of the trunk settle over them like weather. I'll bring a torch Saturday, Earl finally said. Small one. Won't hurt whatever's inside. Saturday, Dorothy agreed. After they left, Dorothy sat alone with her notebook. She wrote down everything. Every dollar spent, every hour worked. The seam in the floor. The iron door. The trunk stamped with her father's initials. At the bottom of the page, she wrote the enigma line again. The one she'd carried since childhood without understanding it. The house is for living in. The land is for keeping. She underlined land twice. She went to bed thinking about 11 lots of orange steaks, running down to a creek that, as far as the county was concerned, belonged to nobody at all. Saturday came with rain. A slow grey drizzle. It turned the gravel road to soup. Ed's truck fishtailed twice on the last hill before the farmhouse. Earl arrived an hour later, a small cutting torch in a canvas bag. The three of them went down into the cellar together, into the dry stone room. They stood around the steel trunk like mourners at a graveside. You want to do the honours? Earl asked Dorothy. Or you want me to? You do it, she said. You've got the steady hands. Earl lit the torch. The small blue flame ate through 76 years of weld in under 10 minutes. The smell of hot metal filled the little room. When the last of it gave, he stepped back. Dorothy stepped forward. She lifted the lid herself. The hinges, unwelded now, moved easy. On top sat a coffee tin. The old kind with a metal lid. Arbuckle's brand, faded but readable. Dorothy lifted it out. It was heavier than a coffee tin should be. When she shook it gently because Ed had cautioned her, something inside rattled. Dense. Metallic. Open it, Ed said. She worked the lid loose with the pry bar. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of felt gone stiff with age, were silver dollars. 40 of them, stacked in rolls. Each one dated. Each one dark with tarnish but unmistakably real. Earl picked one up. He turned it in the headlamp light. He went very quiet. Earl, Dorothy said. 1921, he said. Morgan dollar. He picked up another. 1923. Dorothy, these are all pre-1948. Everyone I've checked. What does that mean? It means, Earl said slowly, whatever Walter put in this trunk, he put it in before he welded the lid shut. This isn't something added later. This is 1948. Dated and done. It's been sitting exactly like this ever since. 40 silver dollars, Dorothy wrote in her notebook that night. Worth, by weight alone, somewhere around $1,100. Collector value could run higher, depending on condition and mint mark. She underlined the word collector. She had already begun to suspect that nothing in this trunk was going to be simple arithmetic. Beneath the coffee tin was a bundle wrapped in oilskin, tied with wax string. Earl's careful fingers untied it without tearing. Inside were papers, dozens of them, brittle at the edges but dry. The room had done exactly what her father built it to do. They spread the papers across the kitchen table upstairs, out of the damp, under the good lamp Dorothy had brought from her old house. Receipts mostly, a dairy ledger in her father's own hand. The same ledger habit Dorothy had learned from him, without ever knowing where it came from. Tax records from the 40s and 50s. A photograph of Walter Kessler as a young man, standing beside another man Dorothy didn't recognise. Both of them in front of a fence line running toward a creek. Near the bottom of the stack was a single folded document, heavier paper than the rest, sealed once with wax that had long since crumbled away. Dorothy unfolded it carefully. A deed, county recorded, Elkton Courthouse, dated March of 1948. It described in dense legal language a 40-acre parcel, bounded by Hollow Creek on the east, the old fence line on the west. It named the owner, in ink gone brown but perfectly legible. Walter A. Kessler, sole and separate. Earl, Dorothy said. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Earl leaned over the table. He read it twice. This is the back 40, he said, recorded separate from the house parcel. Your daddy split it off on purpose, Dorothy, and never folded it back in. Why would he do that? Earl was quiet a moment, looking at the old photograph. The two young men, the fence line. There was a dispute, he said finally, long before your time, your daddy and a neighbour, over that exact fence line, back in the 40s. I was just a boy clerking at the courthouse when it came through. I remember the file being thick. Your father won it, clean and recorded. I always heard he never trusted the county not to lose track of it again. Man kept his own copy of everything after that. Buried it, apparently. In the most literal sense there is. Dorothy sat down slowly at her father's kitchen table, the deed in her hands. She thought about the surveyors, their orange stakes running clean down to the creek. 40 acres. Her son had sold something he did not legally own to a developer who thought he was buying 11 finished lots. She called the bank the next morning. Not Gary's bank, the one she still used herself, where her friend Marjorie Dunn worked a teller window. 22 years now. Marjorie, Dorothy said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me only what's proper for you to tell me. Dorothy, you know I will if I can. Has my son taken out any loans recently? Anything involving the old Kessler land? There was a pause, the careful pause of a woman who values her job and her friendship in equal measure. I can't discuss account details, Marjorie said, but I will tell you because it's common knowledge, not account information. Gary's been telling half of Piney Fork he's got a bridge loan riding on that subdivision closing by the end of next month. And everybody in the diner already knows it. If that deal falls through, your son is in a very tight spot financially. Dorothy thanked her and hung up. She sat with that information the way she sat with everything now, turning it over slowly, writing it in the notebook. Gary's bridge loan, a deadline at the end of next month, and a subdivision plat filed on land that, according to a deed sealed in a welded trunk for 76 years, was never his to sell. She did not call Gary, not yet. She thought about what her father used to say. The man who talks first in a negotiation is usually the man who needs something. Dorothy did not need anything from Gary. She needed the deed authenticated properly, recorded. She needed to understand exactly what she was holding before she let anyone else know she was holding it. She spent the following week doing precisely that, driving the deed to Elkton, sitting with a title attorney named Pauline Ruiz. $150 for an hour of consultation. Pauline told her in careful professional language that the back 40 acres had legally belonged to Walter Kessler in 1948, if the document was what it appeared to be. That is, if it had never been superseded by any later transfer. And upon his death, absent any other recorded conveyance, it would have passed according to the terms of his will. Do you have his will? Pauline asked. I have the will that gave me the house, Dorothy said. I never saw anything mentioning a separate 40 acres. Then we need to find it, Pauline said, or we need the original probate file. Either one will tell us where that land went when your father died. Right now, Mrs. Kessler, what you're describing is a parcel that may never have legally transferred to anyone at all, which under the law would mean it passed to his heirs by default. And you, unless I'm mistaken, are his only surviving child. Dorothy Kessler drove home from Elkton that afternoon in the rain, past the turn-off for Hollow Creek Road, past the orange stakes, multiplying now along the tree line, surveyors marking lots for a subdivision that did not yet legally exist. And she thought something she'd not let herself think in 6 weeks. She might not be the one who ends up with nothing. The probate file took 2 weeks to locate, buried in a storage annex behind the Elkton courthouse, where records older than 50 years went to be forgotten, by everyone except one clerk, a patient young man named Desmond Farr, who still believed old paper mattered. Desmond found it on a Thursday afternoon, a thin folder from 1979, the year Walter Kessler's own father died, the year the Kessler landholdings first split apart. It was not, as it turned out, Walter's death that mattered here at all. It was the estate before his own father's. Buried 3 pages in was a single line. It made Desmond call Dorothy the moment he found it. Mrs. Kessler, he said, you're going to want to come down here. The line, typed on a manual typewriter decades ago, read, the 40-acre parcel bounded by Hollow Creek, previously in dispute per case number 1, 948-CV-114, is confirmed as the sole and separate property of Walter A. Kessler. It shall not form part of the general estate. There was a case number, Dorothy said. A lawsuit. There was, Desmond said. I pulled the case file too. You should sit down for this part. Dorothy sat, in a hard plastic chair in the records annex. Desmond laid out a second folder, older and more fragile than the first. Case number 1948, Civil, 114, Walter A. Kessler, Plaintiff, versus a man named Rufus Aldine, Defendant, over the boundary line of the 40-acre parcel along Hollow Creek. Aldine, Dorothy repeated. The name meant nothing to her. It gets more interesting, Desmond said. He turned to the judgment page. Rufus Aldine lost the case. The court found in Walter Kessler's favour, confirmed his ownership, ordered the boundary resurveyed at Aldine's expense. He tapped the family history section, standard in any 1940s land dispute. Rufus Aldine's granddaughter married into a family named Whitfield, and Sandra Whitfield is the maiden name, according to the marriage licence I pulled, of a woman named Sandra Kessler. Your daughter-in-law. Dorothy sat very still in the hard plastic chair. Gary's wife, she said. If the records are right, Gary's wife's great-grandfather is the same man who lost this exact land to your father. In 1948, Dorothy drove home that evening turning the fact over and over, unable to make it lie flat. She had always assumed Gary's certainty about the back 40 came from simple ignorance. A son who never asked the right questions about his own grandfather's paperwork. Now she wondered if it went deeper. If somewhere in Sandra's family, across 3 generations, a grudge about that same 40 acres had quietly survived, waiting for a chance to come back around. She did not know if Gary knew any of it. She suspected he did not. Some inheritances are silence as much as property. Nobody had told Gary about Rufus Aldine, just as nobody had told Dorothy about the trunk, until the day the ground gave up its seam. That night, going back through the oilskin bundle a second time, more carefully, Dorothy found what she had missed. A letter, handwritten, dated the year before her father died. Folded small, tucked into the spine of the dairy ledger, where it would be easy to overlook. My dear Dorothy, it began, and her hands went still around the page. If you are reading this, you have found the room, and that means you have needed it, which I am sorry for. It means something in this family went the way I feared it might. I built that trunk shut for the boundary fight with the Aldines. A man learns not to trust paper that isn't buried, where a courthouse fire or a careless clerk cannot reach it. I kept a copy of everything, always, in case somebody someday tried to say the land was never mine. Or worse, tried to say it after I was gone. I never told you the whole story of the Aldine case. It was ugly and old, and I did not want you carrying it. But I will tell you this much. Rufus Aldine never let it go. Not really. Men like that pass their grievances down, the way other men pass down a watch or a rifle. If his people ever come back around this land, you will know it, because they will act certain. The way people act when they believe a thing was always theirs. The house is for living in, Dorothy. I built it. Your mother filled it. You grew up in it. It will always be just a house. The land is for keeping. Because land is the one thing that remembers who fought for it. Long after the people who fought are gone. Count the tins if you ever need proof. There are more answers below the coffee than above it. I love you. I always did. I am sorry I could not say it as easily as I could build a room to say it for me. Your father, Walter. Dorothy read it 3 times before she could set it down. Then she went back to the coffee tin, still sitting on her kitchen table where it had sat since Saturday. She lifted the felt lining a second time, more carefully, the way a man who buried the truth in tears would expect his daughter to look. Beneath the felt, flat against the bottom of the tin, was a photograph she had missed. Herself, 7 years old, standing in front of the very fence line named in the deed. Her father's hand on her shoulder, both of them squinting into an old camera's flash. On the back, in her father's hand, Dorothy, age 7. The day I showed her the line. She already knew where it ran. She just didn't know why yet. Dorothy sat at her father's table, the photograph and the letter and the deed spread in front of her. For the first time since the sheriff's deputy stood on her old porch, she cried. Not from grief this time. From something else entirely. The particular ache of being loved by a man who spent his whole life proving it in ways too quiet to notice. Until it was almost too late. She called Earl the next morning. She read him the letter. He was quiet a long while on the other end of the line. Your daddy, Earl finally said, was the most careful man I ever met. I buried 3 wives worth of careful men in this county, Dorothy. I'll bring the plat maps up Saturday. We're going to walk that fence line together. We're going to make sure every stake those surveyors put in the ground lines up. With a deed your son never had the right to sell. 2 days later, Gary called her. For the first time in 6 weeks, his voice did not sound like a man on a golf course. "Mom," he said, "there's a hold on the subdivision plat. Some clerk down at the county flagged a title issue on the back parcel. Do you know anything about that?" Dorothy Kessler looked out the kitchen window at the back 40, gold in the late afternoon light. She thought about a man who welded a trunk shut 76 years ago, because he knew even then that someday somebody would come looking to take what was never theirs. "I might," she said. "Come up to the house, Gary. I think it's time we talked." Ed came by the morning after Dorothy found the letter. He carried a dozen eggs the way he always did. He found her sitting on the porch, the letter still in her lap. She admitted it was probably the 10th reading since the night before. "You look like a woman who didn't sleep," Ed said. He set the eggs on the porch rail. "I didn't. Much." She held the letter out to him. "Read it, Ed. Tell me I'm not imagining what it says." Ed read it slowly, his lips moving faintly, the way they had since Dorothy first knew him. A man who had never been much for books but respected them anyway. When he finished, he folded it carefully along its original creases. He handed it back with both hands, the way you'd hand back something worth more than its weight. "Your daddy loved you something fierce," he said. Man built a whole room in the ground to say it properly. "I don't know many men who'd go to that trouble." "He was not an easy man to talk to," Dorothy said. "I loved him. I don't think I ever doubted he loved me. But we didn't say it much. Either of us. This is the most he's ever said it. And he's been gone 11 years. Sometimes that's how the quiet ones do it," Ed said. "They can't say the thing straight out, so they build you something instead. A house, a room, a fence line fought over in court and handed down whole, so you never have to fight for it yourself." Dorothy thought about that, looking out over the back 40, gold in the morning light. "I keep thinking about the Aldeans," she said. "About Sandra." "I don't think she knows any of this, Ed. I don't think Gary does either. 3 generations. Neither of them has any idea they're standing on the exact same grudge their great-grandparents left behind. Might be time somebody told them," Ed said. "Might be," Dorothy agreed, "but not before the hearing. I want the deed to speak for itself first. Family history can come after. I don't want anybody thinking I dug this up to embarrass Sandra's people. I dug it up because it's the truth." The truth happened to have her family's name folded into it. Ed nodded slowly, understanding the distinction, the way a man raised in the same small-town code always would. "You want breakfast?" he asked. "I brought eggs. Seems a shame to let a good dozen sit on a porch rail all morning." They ate together in the kitchen, the same table where the deed and the letter and the photograph still sat. For a while, neither of them talked about lawsuits or grudges or grandsons who could not pay their bridge loans. Just ordinary things. The weather turning. Ed's arthritis in his left knee. Whether the creek would freeze early this year, the way the almanac was predicting. It was, Dorothy thought afterward, exactly the kind of ordinary morning her father would have approved of. Plain food and plain talk between 2 people who had known each other most of a lifetime. Undisturbed by the fact that a courtroom, 11 days off, was about to decide the fate of 40 acres. And a marriage. And a bridge loan. All at once. She drove into Piney Fork that afternoon for groceries. She stopped, as she often did now, at the diner on Main Street. Marjorie Dunn was taking her lunch break in a back booth. She waved Dorothy over. "You hear anything new?" Dorothy asked, sliding into the booth. "Only what everybody hears," Marjorie said, lowering her voice out of long habit, even though the diner was mostly empty. "Sandra's been in twice this week, asking Pam at the front register about property records. Strange thing for a woman to be doing, if her husband's side of a lawsuit is supposed to be simple. And Gary looked about 10 years older than the last time I saw him. At the gas station Tuesday wouldn't quite meet my eye. He's scared," Dorothy said simply. "I don't take pleasure in that, Marjorie. Whatever it might look like from the outside. Nobody who knows you would think you did," Marjorie said. "You're not a vengeful woman, Dorothy. Never have been. Whatever's happening here, everybody in this town who knows your family understands it's not about spite. It's about a piece of paper your daddy left behind. It finally caught up with the people who forgot it existed." Dorothy appreciated that more than she said out loud. It was, in its own way, exactly the kind of vindication a person in her position quietly needed and rarely received. Not the courtroom kind, still 11 days off. The simpler kind. A friend across a diner table, saying plainly that she had not become someone unrecognizable in the process of standing up for herself. She spent the rest of that week finishing her preparations, exactly as Pauline had instructed, checking every figure twice, confirming every document was in its proper folder. In the evenings after the work was done, she found herself returning again and again to the letter, not out of anxiety this time, out of something closer to comfort. The particular comfort of a voice from the past, a voice that had, against every quiet habit of the man who wrote it, finally said the thing he had spent a whole life meaning. Gary arrived at the farmhouse an hour later, driving a truck that still had the dealer plates on it. A truck Dorothy suspected he could not actually afford anymore, not with a bridge loan sitting over him like weather. He got out slowly, looking at the roof she had re-shingled, the porch she had swept. The whole property looking less like a pile of nothing, more like a house somebody was living in on purpose. "You fixed the roof," he said, like an accusation. "I taught second grade 30 years, Gary. I know how to hold a hammer." He followed her inside, into the kitchen. He stopped short at the sight of the table, the deed, the probate folder, the coffee tin, the photograph of a 7-year-old Dorothy at a fence line, the letter in their father's hand. "What is all this?" Gary said. Dorothy heard something under the question that had not been there 6 weeks ago, on the golf course, something closer to fear. "Sit down," Dorothy said. "I'll make coffee." "Mum, I don't have time for coffee. The subdivision closing is in 11 days. I need to know why there's a title hold on the back parcel." "Because the back parcel was never in the estate you thought it was in," Dorothy said. Pouring water into the propane percolator, her hands steady. Gary's were not. She noted it with some private satisfaction. "Your grandfather split those 40 acres off in 1948, after a lawsuit. Recorded them in his own name, sole and separate. It never got folded back into the general estate when he died. It came to me, Gary. Not to you. Not to whoever you sold it to. That's not possible. I checked the deed on the house parcel before I ever talked to Tomlin. 6 acres, your name. I had it transferred to me 6 years ago." 6 acres, Dorothy said. "The house and the immediate grounds. Not the 40 acres running down to the creek. That parcel has its own deed, Gary. I have it right here on this table. And a county probate file that confirms it never transferred to anyone but me." Gary sat down, finally hard, in the chair across from her. He put his head in his hands for a long moment. "Russ Tomlin has already paid deposits on 11 lots," he said, "mostly to the table. I use part of that money as collateral on a bridge loan, to cover survey and permitting costs. If the plat gets voided, I have to pay that loan back in full, in 30 days. Or the bank takes the collateral. Which is..." He stopped. "Which is what, Gary?" "Which is the house on Larkspur Street," he said quietly. "The one I bought from you. It's still mortgaged. I used the equity." Dorothy set a coffee cup in front of her son. She sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The percolator ticking on the propane burner. The late afternoon light coming gold through the kitchen window. The same light of every afternoon of Dorothy's childhood, in this same room. "Did you know," she said finally, "that Sandra's family in this land have history?" Gary looked up. "What do you mean?" "Her great-grandfather, a man named Rufus Aldine, sued my father over this exact boundary line, in 1948, and lost. Badly, from what Earl tells me. From what the case file says, your father-in-law's family has been certain, for 3 generations, that this land was theirs, and got taken from them unfairly. I don't think that's a coincidence, Gary. I think somewhere in your marriage, without either of you realizing it, an old grudge found its way back, to the same 40 acres. Gary's face had gone the particular grey of a man doing arithmetic he did not want to do. "Sandra's the one who found the surveyor," he said slowly. "She said her cousin worked for a firm that could get us a fast plat filed. Get ahead of any competing subdivision proposals in the area. She was so insistent on the timeline. I thought it was just her being efficient. Or it was somebody who had been waiting a long time," Dorothy said, "to get this particular piece of ground back, and finally saw a way to do it through her own husband." Without ever having to say the family name out loud, she did not say it to be cruel, she said it flat. The way she'd learned to deliver hard truths to 7-year-olds who needed to hear them, without being crushed by them. Gary sat across from her, his coffee going cold. For the first time since he had sold her house, he looked like a man beginning to understand something. How much of his own life he had been navigating blind. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Dorothy said, "we let the county do what the county is supposed to do. I've had a title attorney confirm the parcel. Earl Voss is walking the boundary with the old plat maps this Saturday to make certain every stake lines up. And I've requested an emergency title hearing, since you already have one scheduled, to try to force this plat through before your loan comes due. You requested a hearing." Gary's voice cracked slightly on the word requested, as though he had expected his mother to fight him some other way. A lawyer's letter, a lawsuit, anything but simply walking into the same institutional machinery he had tried to use against her. "I did," Dorothy said. "It's in 11 days. Same day as your closing deadline, as it happens." Pauline Ruiz suggested it. I agreed. Sometimes the fastest way to settle a thing is to let it be settled. In the same room where somebody tried to steal it. Gary did not say anything for a long moment. Then, quietly, in a voice Dorothy had not heard since he was a boy, admitting to something shameful. "Mom, if the plat gets voided and I default on the bridge loan, I could lose the house. Sandra and I could lose everything." Dorothy looked at her son across the table, at the man who had put 2 cardboard boxes on her porch, who had told her Sunset Manor was for her own good. She felt something complicated move through her. Not quite forgiveness, not quite anger. Something more like the particular grief of a mother watching her child reap a harvest he had planted without knowing what seeds he was using. "I'm not doing this to hurt you, Gary," she said. "I'm doing this because it's mine. Your grandfather made sure of that 76 years ago, long before either of us was born. I intend to honour what he did, whatever that means for you and Sandra." "You could still stop the hearing," Gary said. "You could let the sale go through. Take a cut. We could work something out, Mum. Just family. No lawyers." "No," Dorothy said. There was no anger in it, only the same flat finality she'd used on the sheriff's deputy. And on Ed at the bottom of the ladder. "I spent 41 years in a house you sold without telling me. I am not spending what's left of my life negotiating quietly. So you can keep pretending none of this happened." Gary left without finishing his coffee. Dorothy watched his truck, the one with dealer plates he could no longer afford, pull back down the gravel drive, out onto Hollow Creek Road. She sat alone at her father's table a long while afterward, looking at the letter in Walter Kessler's hand, at the line she had underlined twice. The land is for keeping. She had 11 days until the hearing. She spent them the way her father would have spent them. Carefully. On paper. With every fact in its place. And every dollar accounted for. Ed came by that same evening, later than usual, a bag of late tomatoes in one hand. "Saw Gary's truck heading down the mountain earlier," he said, setting the bag on the counter. He looked like a man who'd had a rough afternoon. "He had," Dorothy said. She told Ed everything. The bridge loan, the mortgage on the Larkspur Street house, the Aldine name buried 3 generations back in Sandra's family tree. Ed sat down slowly at the table, the same table where Gary had sat an hour before with his head in his hands. "Lord," he said, "that poor family's been carrying a grudge like a stone in their shoe. 76 years, and never even knew it was in there." "That's about the size of it," Dorothy agreed. "You holding up all right? This can't be easy, watching your own boy come apart at your kitchen table." "I'm holding up," Dorothy said. "It isn't easy." "But it isn't supposed to be easy, Ed. My father didn't build that room so somebody's grandson could have an easy time of it. He built it so the truth would still be standing. Whatever else fell down around it." Ed nodded and reached over and patted her hand once, the way an old friend does when there isn't anything left worth saying out loud. 11 days, he said. 11 days, Dorothy agreed. Earl came up Saturday morning, his cardboard tube of maps, a metal detector he'd borrowed from his grandson. "Because," he said, if Walter Kessler went to the trouble of welding a trunk shut, there was no telling what else the man might have buried. Along a boundary line he cared enough about to sue a neighbour over, they walked the fence line together, Dorothy, Ed, and Earl, starting at the corner post nearest the house, working east toward the creek. Earl checking his father's old survey notes against the orange stakes the county crew had already planted. "Here," Earl said, 40 minutes in. He crouched at a rusted iron pipe driven deep into the ground, barely visible above the grass. Original corner marker, 1948. Matches the deed to the inch. He walked another 100 yards, checking his notes against the newer stakes. He stopped again, frowning. "Dorothy," he said, "come look at this." The orange stake the subdivision surveyors had planted sat nearly 30 feet inside what Earl's old plat clearly marked as the Kessler boundary, meaning whoever drew up the Hollow Creek Estates plan had either made an error or simply assumed the boundary ran wherever was most convenient for 11 lots to fit cleanly. 30 feet, Ed said. That's not a rounding error. That's somebody drawing the map they wanted. Instead of the map that's true. Or somebody who never checked at all, Earl said. Because they were relying on a deed that only covered 6 acres, and assumed the rest just came along with it. They found 2 more discrepancies before the walk was done, both in the same direction, both shaving land off the Kessler side, onto the platted lots. By the time they reached the creek, the metal detector had turned up nothing more dramatic than a rusted horseshoe and an old fence staple. But Dorothy did not need buried treasure at this point. She needed a deed, a probate file, and a fence line that matched the paper. By Saturday afternoon, walking back toward the farmhouse with mud on her boots and a spiral notebook full of measurements, she had all 3. That evening she called Pauline Ruiz. She read her the numbers. "That's good," Pauline said. "That's very good, Mrs. Kessler. A verified survey discrepancy, combined with the original deed and the probate confirmation, gives us essentially everything we need. I'll have Earl's findings notarized before the hearing. Is he willing to testify? He said he'd bring his father's original notes, stand up and read every measurement himself. If it came to that, it'll come to that, Pauline said. Mr. Kessler's attorney is going to argue the plat should stand, because the developer relied on it in good faith. That's a real argument, legally speaking, but it doesn't survive a properly recorded deed that predates everything else on the table. We're in a strong position. Bring the original trunk deed, the probate folder, Mr. Voss's survey findings. Nothing else. Keep it simple. Judges appreciate simple. Dorothy spent the following days doing exactly that. Organising the paper the way her father taught her to organise a ledger. Everything labelled, everything in order. Nothing left to chance or memory. She drove into Piney Fork, had copies made at the print shop for $4.20, a small expense she noted in the spiral notebook, out of habit more than necessity. She also, on the Tuesday before the hearing, drove to the bank. She sat down with Marjorie Dunn, not to ask for information this time, just because she wanted to see a friendly face, because Marjorie, more than almost anyone in Piney Fork, understood exactly what a dollar figure could do to a family. "How's Gary holding up?" Marjorie asked, careful and quiet. The way you ask about somebody's difficult relative. "Scared," Dorothy said. Which I suppose is fair. He built a whole plan on land that was never his. Now the plan is coming down around him. You don't sound like you're enjoying it. "I'm not," Dorothy said. And meant it. I loved that boy since before he could walk. I'm not doing this to hurt him. I'm doing it because my father spent his whole life protecting something. I will not be the generation that lets it slip away. Because I was too polite to stand up in a courtroom. Marjorie reached across the counter. She squeezed Dorothy's hand. A small gesture. The kind 2 women who have known each other 40 years can exchange without needing a single additional word. The night before the hearing, Dorothy sat alone at her father's kitchen table, all of the papers spread in front of her one last time. The 1948 deed. The probate file with its single crucial sentence. Earl's survey notes, now notarized and bound. The letter in Walter Kessler's own hand. The photograph of herself at 7 years old, standing at the fence line with her father's hand on her shoulder. She read the letter one more time, all the way through, lingering on the line about the trunk, about a man learning not to trust paper unless he buried it somewhere a courthouse fire or a careless clerk could not reach. She thought about how right he had been, in the end. A subdivision plat filed on assumption instead of survey was exactly the kind of careless mistake he had spent 76 years guarding against. She thought too about Gary, about Sandra, about a grudge passed down like a watch or a rifle across 3 generations, without either of them fully understanding what they were carrying. She did not know if she could fix that. She only knew she could not fix it by pretending the deed did not exist. At 11 o'clock, unable to sleep, she walked out onto the porch in her housecoat. She looked out at the back 40 in the moonlight, silver and quiet, the creek a thin dark line at the far edge of it. Somewhere out there were the orange stakes, 30 feet in the wrong place, marking a subdivision that would very likely never be built. "I found it, Daddy," she said out loud. To nobody. To the dark. The way she sometimes still talked to Robert, on nights when the house felt too quiet. "I found the room. I found the deed. Tomorrow I'm going to stand up in front of a judge and make sure nobody ever forgets whose land this is." She went back inside, checked the lock on the front door out of habit, though there had been no lock worth the name for years. She slept better that night than she had in 6 weeks. Not since a deputy set 2 cardboard boxes on a porch that no longer belonged to her. The morning of the hearing came clear and cold, the first real frost of the season, silvering the grass along Hollow Creek Road. Dorothy dressed carefully, a navy dress she had not worn since Robert's funeral, sensible shoes, her spiral notebook tucked into a canvas bag, alongside the folder of documents Pauline had assembled. Ed offered to drive her. She said yes. There was no shame in accepting a ride from a good neighbour. And some mornings, a woman is glad not to be entirely alone. Earl met them in the courthouse parking lot in Elkton, wearing a suit that looked like it had last been worn to a funeral sometime in the previous decade, his cardboard tube of maps under one arm, a leather folder of notarized survey notes under the other. "You ready?" he asked. "I've been ready for 76 years, Dorothy said. "I just didn't know it." They walked in together, past the same recorder of deeds office where a young clerk had first told Dorothy about a title flag on a parcel pending. Up the marble stairs to the second-floor courtroom. A docket clerk checked names against a list. He directed them to a bench outside courtroom 2. Dorothy Kessler sat with her hands folded over her canvas bag. She waited for her name to be called, the way she had waited her whole life for the things that mattered most. Patient, precise, entirely unwilling to be moved. 2 days before the hearing, Preston Vance called Pauline Ruiz's office directly, a move Pauline described to Dorothy as either confidence or desperation. In her experience, it was almost always the second one wearing the first one's coat. "He's offering a settlement," Pauline told Dorothy over the phone. "Gary's side wants to avoid the hearing altogether. They're proposing you receive a lump sum, $60,000, paid from the developer's deposit funds, in exchange for a quick claim on the 40 acres, letting the subdivision proceed as platted." Dorothy sat with the number a long moment. $60,000 was more cash than she had held at one time in her whole life. She understood exactly why Gary's side had chosen it. A number large enough to feel generous to a woman who had spent 6 weeks living in a farmhouse with a hole in its roof, small enough to leave the subdivision profitable once it closed. "What do you think it's worth?" Dorothy asked. "The land itself, not the offer." "Conservatively, with the timber alone, we're looking at somewhere north of $800,000, Pauline said, "once it's properly assessed. That's before any mineral or water rights nobody's bothered to check, given your father's habits. 60,000 is not a fair number, Mrs. Kessler. It's a number designed to feel large to somebody who doesn't yet know what she's holding." "I know what I'm holding," Dorothy said. "I've known since the day Earl cut that weld." "Then you understand my recommendation." "Decline it," Dorothy said. "Tell Mr. Vance I said no. Tell him I said it the same way I've said no to everything else these last 6 weeks. Politely and completely." Pauline delivered the message that afternoon. By evening, Gary called the farmhouse directly, his voice tight in a way Dorothy had come to recognize, the sound of a man watching his options narrow one at a time. "You turned down $60,000, he said. Without greeting. "I did. Mom, that's real money. That's more than you've probably had in the bank at once, in your whole life." "It is," Dorothy agreed. "It's also less than a tenth of what that land is actually worth, Gary. I didn't spend 6 weeks finding your grandfather's trunk just to sign it away. For a number your own lawyer picked because he thought it would sound big to an old woman." There was a long silence on the line. "Sandra thinks we should just let the hearing happen," Gary said finally. "Quieter now," she said, and I'm quoting her, "that a family lying to itself for 3 generations ought to just let a judge finish it." The sentence, she meant. Dorothy had not expected that. From Sandra of all people. Something in it eased a knot she had been carrying. Since the day Desmond Farr first said the name Aldine out loud in the records annex. "She might be right," Dorothy said. "I think she is," Gary said. I hate it, but I think she is. The call ended without either of them saying much more. Dorothy sat afterward at the kitchen table, thinking about how strange it was. The daughter-in-law she had never fully trusted. The one whose family history had apparently helped set this whole chain of events in motion without either of them realizing it. She might turn out to be the one clear voice in the family, willing to say the plain truth out loud. The day before the hearing, Russ Tomlin's own attorney called Pauline's office. A separate, unsolicited call that Pauline found more revealing than anything Preston Vance had offered. Tomlin, it seemed, had grown nervous enough about the underlying title question to commission his own independent review of the survey. His review had turned up the same discrepancy Earl found walking the fence line by hand, with 60-year-old notes and a borrowed metal detector. He wanted to know, Pauline told Dorothy, whether you'd be open to negotiating directly with him, cutting Gary out of it entirely, since it's clear to him now that Gary never had clear title to sell in the first place. What did you tell him? I told him the hearing was tomorrow. That I'd let the judge settle the question of title. Because that's precisely what the hearing was for. And that any conversation about the land after that would need to start from whatever the court determined, not before. Good, Dorothy said. I don't want to negotiate around a courtroom. I want to walk into one. That night, Dorothy went through the documents one final time. The deed, the probate file, Earl's notarized survey notes, the letter, laying them out in the order Pauline had instructed, checking each page against the checklist Pauline had given her. Her father had taught her something. The surest way to walk into a hard room unafraid was to already know, cold, everything anyone in that room could possibly ask you. She thought about Rufus Aldine, a man 3 generations gone, whose grievance had somehow outlived him long enough to nearly cost her son his marriage, and his house both. She thought about her father, sitting in this same kitchen 76 years earlier, deciding that the only way to protect a piece of ground from that kind of grievance was to bury the proof so deep, nothing but patience and love could ever bring it back up. She thought finally about herself at 7 years old, standing at a fence line with her father's hand on her shoulder. Already, according to his note on the back of the photograph, knowing where the line ran, long before she understood why it mattered, she understood now. Tomorrow she intended to make certain a courtroom understood it too. The morning of the hearing, before Ed arrived to drive them, Dorothy sat once more at her father's table with Earl. He had come up early with a thermos of his wife's coffee, and a nervous energy Dorothy had not seen in him since the day he first cut the weld off the trunk. You nervous? She asked him. Some, Earl admitted. Haven't testified in a courtroom in going on 15 years. Used to do it regular, back when boundary disputes were half my working life. Feels different when it's not just a job. Feels different when it's Walter's daughter sitting at that table. You'll do fine, Dorothy said. You've done the hard part already. You walked the line. Your daddy would be proud of you, Earl said, not looking at her, busying himself instead with the thermos lid. I don't say that lightly. I knew Walter Kessler 40 years. He was not an easy man to impress. He was not free with his praise. But he'd be proud of what you've done here. Patient. Careful. Never raised your voice once, through any of it. Far as I can tell, there didn't seem to be a reason to, Dorothy said. The paper does the shouting. I just have to bring it into the room. Earl smiled at that, small and genuine. He folded his notarized survey notes back into their leather case. The two of them sat a while longer in the quiet kitchen, listening to the propane burner tick as the coffee warmed, until Ed's truck came up the gravel road right on time to carry them both down into Elkton. And whatever the day still had waiting for them, on the courthouse steps, Gary and Sandra arrived at almost the same moment as Dorothy, Ed, and Earl, an awkward convergence of both sides of the family. They had shared Thanksgiving tables for 2 decades. Now they stood a few feet apart on cold marble. Unsure how close was appropriate, Sandra was the one who spoke first. Mrs. Kessler, she said. Her voice was steadier than Dorothy expected. Whatever happens in there, I want you to know. I didn't know about my great-grandfather's case until 3 days ago. Gary told me what you found. I made my own calls to my mother after that. She confirmed it. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. Thank you for saying that much, Dorothy said. It's more than most people manage. Gary stood beside his wife, hands in his coat pockets, saying nothing. Dorothy recognized in his silence the particular helplessness of a man who has run out of arguments and has not yet decided what to do with the space that leaves behind. "We should go in," Earl said quietly, checking his watch. The small, strange gathering broke apart into its two sides once more, filing through the courthouse doors a few feet, and a lifetime of history apart. Courtroom 2 was smaller than Dorothy expected, wood-panelled. A low railing separated the gallery from the two long tables where opposing sides sat. Gary was already there when the bailiff called the case, seated at the left table beside a lawyer in an expensive grey suit. Beside Gary sat Sandra, in a cream blazer. Her jaw set tight, her eyes fixed straight ahead, like a woman determined not to look at her mother-in-law across the room. Russ Tomlin, the developer, sat one row back in the gallery, arms crossed, a man clearly deciding how much of the next hour was going to cost him. Dorothy sat at the right table with Pauline Ruiz, her canvas bag on the floor by her feet, her spiral notebook resting on top of the folder of documents. Earl sat in the gallery behind her, his cardboard tube of maps across his knees. Ed sat beside him, hat in his lap, looking like a man attending church on a day he had not expected to. Judge Miriam Castellano took the bench. She reviewed the docket sheet for a long moment. She looked up over her glasses at both tables. "This is an emergency hearing on a title dispute," she said, regarding a subdivision plat filed against a parcel identified as the back 40 acres of the Kessler property on Hollow Creek Road. "I understand there's a closing deadline pressing on this matter. Let's proceed efficiently. Mr. Kessler's counsel, you may begin." Gary's attorney, a man named Preston Vance, stood. He made his case smoothly, the kind of smooth that comes from having made similar cases many times before. He argued that Gary Kessler had held clear title to the house parcel for 6 years, that a subdivision plat had been filed in good faith, that a developer had already invested substantial funds relying on that filing, that any title irregularity on the back parcel was, at most, a clerical matter, one that should be resolved through the normal course of business, not by derailing a closing that 11 families and one legitimate development company were counting on. "Good faith reliance," Vance said, "matters in this county, Your Honour. Mr. Kessler acted as any reasonable property owner would, believing the full acreage was his by inheritance." Judge Castellano nodded. She made a note. She turned to Pauline. "Ms. Ruiz." Pauline stood, calm, unhurried. Dorothy noticed, not for the first time, that her attorney had the same particular stillness her father used to have, right before he said something that mattered. "Your Honour, my client does not dispute that Gary Kessler believed, in good faith, that he owned the entire property. The problem is not his belief. The problem is the underlying record, which we can show clearly establishes that belief was mistaken." She opened the folder. "In 1948, Walter Kessler, my client's late father, prevailed in a boundary dispute. Case number 1, 948-CV-114, against a neighbour named Rufus Aldine, over precisely this 40-acre parcel. Following that judgment, Mr. Kessler recorded the parcel in his own name, sole and separate, at the Elkton Courthouse. That deed has never been superseded by any subsequent transfer." She handed the deed to the bailiff. He carried it to the bench. Judge Castellano examined it, turned it over, checked the recording stamp, set it down without comment. When Walter Kessler's father's estate was probated in 1979, Pauline continued, "The probate file explicitly excludes this parcel from the general estate, citing the same case number, confirming it as Walter Kessler's sole and separate property. When Walter Kessler himself died 11 years ago, his will left the house and immediate grounds, 6 acres, to his daughter Dorothy Kessler. It made no mention of the back 40, because the back 40 was never folded back into any estate to begin with. Under this state's intestacy provisions, property never disposed of by will passes to the decedent's heirs. Dorothy Kessler is Walter Kessler's only surviving child." Judge Castellano looked up. "You're saying the 40 acres passed to Mrs. Kessler by operation of law, separate from the will entirely." "That is exactly what we're saying, Your Honour. We have the probate file, the original deed, and a certified county recorder's confirmation to support it." Preston Vance rose. "Your Honour, even accepting that as accurate, my client's transaction with the developer relied on a survey and plat prepared by a licensed firm. If there's a boundary question, it's a matter for correction, not for voiding an entire transaction that innocent third parties have relied on. That brings me to my second witness, Pauline said, if the court will allow. Earl Voss walked forward from the gallery. He was sworn in. He took the stand with unhurried confidence, a man who had spent 60 years being right about where lines on the ground actually were. Mr. Voss, Pauline said, you're a retired county surveyor. 41 years, Earl said. Apprenticed under Walter Kessler himself, matter of fact. Back when this county still surveyed half its roads off the back of a mule. A small ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gallery. Judge Castellano allowed herself the smallest smile, then waved Earl on. Last Saturday, Pauline said, did you walk the boundary of the Kessler property? Using your father's original survey notes from the era of the 1948 case. I did. Walked it corner to corner. Dorothy Kessler and Ed Tanner as witnesses. Found the original corner marker, an iron pipe driven in 1948, exactly where the deed says it should be, to the inch. Earl opened his leather folder. Then I checked the new subdivision stakes against those same measurements. The stakes the surveying firm planted for Hollow Creek Estates sit in 3 separate locations inside the Kessler boundary. In one place, by as much as 30 feet. 30 feet, Judge Castellano repeated. Yes, Your Honour. That's not survey tolerance. That's a firm that measured off an assumed line, instead of the recorded deed. Because near as I can tell, nobody pulled the original 1948 parcel record before drawing up those 11 lots. Russ Tomlin in the gallery put his head in his hands. Preston Vance tried once more, asking whether it was possible the discrepancy was the fault of the surveying firm, rather than any defect in the underlying transaction. A fair question. Earl answered it without hesitation. Could be the firm's error, sure, Earl said. Doesn't change whose land it is, though. A bad survey doesn't move a boundary. It just means somebody's going to have expensive lots sitting on the wrong side of a line, one that's been settled, recorded, and public record for 76 years. Judge Castellano set down her pen. She looked over the tables for a long moment, at Gary, pale and still beside his attorney, at Sandra, who had finally turned to look at Dorothy across the room, an expression Dorothy could not quite read, something between fear and something older, something that might have been recognition of a debt 3 generations overdue. I've heard enough, the judge said. The court finds the deed of record from 1948 establishes clear and unbroken title to the 40-acre parcel in Dorothy Kessler. So does the probate confirmation from 1979, passing by operation of law upon her father's death. The subdivision plat filed against this parcel is void as to the acreage in question. Any closing predicated on that plat cannot proceed as filed. The gavel came down, quiet, almost gentle, the way a small thing can end a matter that has waited 76 years to be settled. Russ Tomlin stood immediately. He buttoned his jacket. He walked out of the courtroom without a word to Gary, the particular silent exit of a man calculating exactly how much this morning had cost him, already composing the phone call he would make to pull his deposits back. Gary sat frozen at the table for a long moment after the gavel fell, staring at nothing. Then, slowly, he stood. He walked toward Dorothy. The whole courtroom seemed to hold still, to watch what her son would do next. "Mom," he said. His voice cracked on the single word. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know any of it." "I believe you," Dorothy said. And she did. Mostly. She had raised him. She knew the particular shape of his lies from the particular shape of his truth. This had the sound of truth in it. "What happens to the loan?" he asked. "What happens to the house?" "I don't know," Dorothy said honestly. "That's between you and the bank now. But I'll tell you what I told you a week ago. In my kitchen, Gary. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing it because your grandfather spent his whole life protecting a piece of ground he believed mattered. I will not be the one who lets it slip away, just because it would have been easier for everyone if I had stayed quiet." Sandra had not moved from the table, her hands folded tight in her lap. Dorothy, gathering her canvas bag, walked over before she could think better of it. "Sandra," she said, "I know about your great-grandfather, about Rufus Aldine, and the case, and what your family believed about this land for 3 generations. Sandra's face went white. "How do you—" "It doesn't matter how," What matters is I don't believe you did any of this out of spite. And I don't believe Gary did either. I think an old grudge found its way into a marriage, without either of you fully understanding what you were carrying. I'm not angry at you, Sandra. I'm sorry, actually, that nobody in either family ever sat down and settled this honestly 76 years ago, instead of letting it come out this way, in a courtroom, in front of strangers. Sandra did not answer, but something in her shoulders loosened. Just slightly, the way a fist loosens when a hand finally sets down something heavy. Something it has been carrying without ever quite realizing the weight of it. The weeks after the hearing moved the way weeks do after a storm passes. Slow at first, then faster. Everyone left to sort through what had been knocked loose. Russ Tomlin's firm formally withdrew from the Hollow Creek Estates project 11 days after the ruling, filing a one-paragraph notice with the county planning board, citing in the flattest possible language an inability to secure clear title to the platted acreage. Behind that flat language, as Marjorie Dunn reported over coffee at the diner, was a much louder conversation happening in Elkton real estate circles about a developer who had sunk $210,000 into permitting, surveying, and deposits, on land he never actually owned a clear path to. Gary's bridge loan came due 19 days after the hearing. Without the subdivision closing to cover it, he was forced into a hard conversation with the bank. It ended, according to what Dorothy eventually pieced together, in a forced sale of a rental property he and Sandra had bought 2 years earlier, netting just enough to satisfy the loan and avoid losing the house on Larkspur Street outright. You could have let it go through, Gary told his mother, the one time he brought it up directly, sitting again at her kitchen table, 6 weeks after the hearing. Thinner than she remembered him. Quieter. You could have taken a settlement instead of going to court. We could have kept the rental. I could have, Dorothy agreed. But then the 11 families who put deposits down on those lots would have built houses, on land the county would eventually have had to correct anyway. Once somebody finally noticed the old deed, it was never going to stay quiet forever, Gary. Your grandfather made too certain of that. Gary was quiet a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. Sandra's talked to her mother, he said finally, about the Aldine side of things. Turns out her grandmother used to tell a story about a fence line that got taken from the family. Unfair. Back before Sandra was born. Sandra always thought it was just an old family grudge, the kind every family has about something. She never knew there was an actual court case behind it, an actual judgment. Now you both know, Dorothy said. Now we both know, Gary agreed. Something in the way he said it made Dorothy think something. That, knowing, however painful, was doing more good in that marriage than the silence ever had. Earl Voss, in the meantime, had become something of a minor local celebrity at the diner. The retired surveyor who walked a boundary line by hand and found 30 feet of daylight between a subdivision's dream and a courthouse's paper. He came up to the farmhouse most Saturdays still, ostensibly to help Dorothy with repairs, though Dorothy suspected, and did not mind, that he simply liked the company, and the coffee, and the particular satisfaction of having been useful to Walter Kessler's family one more time before he was done being useful to anyone. Ed Tanner kept bringing eggs, same as he always had, as though nothing about the last 2 months had changed the fundamental rhythm of two neighbours who had known each other most of their lives. Dorothy, for her part, spent those weeks doing what she had always done best, keeping the books straight, slowly, patiently, putting the farmhouse back into a shape her father would have recognised. She had the well pump repaired for $640, money that came, with a certain grim satisfaction, from the sale of 40 acres worth of standing timber rights on the back parcel. A legal and fully documented transaction this time. One she conducted herself, with Pauline Ruiz's guidance, recorded properly at the courthouse the same week it closed. The timber sale brought in $81,000, more money than Dorothy had ever held at one time in her life. She wrote the figure in her spiral notebook, in the same small, careful hand she had used for every dollar since she was a girl. She used 11,000 of it to finish the roof properly, hiring a crew this time, instead of doing every shingle herself. Because 75 years old or not, there was a difference. Between proving you could do a thing and needing to do the whole thing alone. She used another 4,000 to have the well house rebuilt, the wood stove serviced, the kitchen wiring brought up to something resembling code, the rest she put away carefully. In an account Marjorie helped her open, An account with only Dorothy Kessler's name on it, and nobody else's. A small private insurance against ever again finding 2 cardboard boxes on a porch with a deadline attached. The county appraisal finally came through. It valued the 40 acres, timber rights excluded but everything else intact, at $940,000. More than 15 times what Gary had gotten for the house on Larkspur Street when he sold it out from under her. Dorothy did not celebrate the number. She simply wrote it down, the way she wrote down every number. She closed the notebook. A figure on a page had never once been the point of any of it. Not for her father, in 1948. Not for her now. What mattered more to her, in those quiet weeks, was the letter. She had it framed eventually, alongside the photograph of herself at 7 years old, standing at the fence line. She hung both in the front room, where the morning light came through clean now, since she'd had the windows reglazed. She read the letter often, not out of grief anymore, out of something closer to company. The particular comfort of a voice that had gone quiet 11 years ago, but had, it turned out, never actually stopped speaking to her. The trunk itself she kept in the front room too. Empty now, the weld cut clean away, the lid standing open. She had thought briefly about having it hauled off, a piece of rusted steel with no further use. But Earl talked her out of it. Man built that with his own hands to keep something safe for 76 years, Earl said. Doesn't seem right to scrap it the first year it's finally allowed to sit open. So it stayed. An old steel trunk, WK-48 stamped faint into one corner, sitting empty and open in a front room that had once again become, in every sense that mattered, a home. Marjorie Dunn called the farmhouse in late September. Not about Gary this time. About Dorothy's new account. "Your first statement's ready," Marjorie said. "Thought you'd want to come in and see it in person, given everything." Dorothy drove into Piney Fork that same afternoon. She sat across from Marjorie at the small desk near the back of the bank, the one reserved for account matters too personal for the teller line. She looked at the number on the page for a long moment. $81,000, Marjorie said quietly. Just from the timber, plus the interest since it posted. "It doesn't feel real," Dorothy admitted. 6 months ago, I didn't know if I'd have a roof over my head by 5 o'clock on a Tuesday. You built this yourself, Dorothy. Every bit of it. Don't let anybody, including yourself, tell you otherwise. Dorothy thought about that driving home. Past the diner, past the gas station where Ed still filled up his truck every Friday like clockwork. Past the turn off for Hollow Creek Road, where the orange stakes had finally, weeks ago, been pulled up and hauled away by a county crew. She had not built it entirely herself. She knew that. Her father had built the foundation 76 years before she ever needed it. In a room with fieldstone walls, behind a door, he welded shut with his own hands. But Marjorie was right about one thing. The digging, the driving, the sitting in cold plastic chairs, in records annexes. The standing up in a courtroom, in a navy dress she hadn't worn since her husband's funeral. That part had been hers alone, and she intended to remember it that way, for whatever years she had left. In late October, a letter arrived at the farmhouse from the County Planning Board. Formal, dense with the kind of language Dorothy had grown accustomed to reading carefully. It confirmed, in its final paragraph, that the Hollow Creek Estates plat had been permanently withdrawn from the county record, effective the date of Judge Castellano's ruling. The parcel in question, 40 acres bounded by Hollow Creek, and the original 1948 survey line remained recorded in the name of Dorothy Kessler, free and clear. She read it twice, standing at her own mailbox at the end of the gravel drive, the same mailbox her father had installed decades earlier, its post a little crooked now, but still standing. She folded the letter carefully. She carried it back up to the house, to add to the growing folder of documents that had, over one long summer, become something like a second ledger. This one not of dollars, but of a fight properly finished. Pauline Ruiz called a week later with one final piece of business. "The timber rights sale is fully closed and recorded," she said, "and I wanted you to know, since you asked me to keep an eye on it, that Russ Tomlin's firm formally dissolved last month. Nothing to do with you directly, from what I understand. More a matter of several projects collapsing around the same time. Creditors losing patience. But I thought you'd want to know the whole business is well and truly finished." "Thank you, Pauline," Dorothy said, "for everything. I don't think I ever properly said that. You said it plenty, Mrs. Kessler. In the way that matters most. You paid your bill on time. You never once asked me to bend a fact to make a case sound better than it was. That's rarer than you'd think in this line of work. Dorothy hung up the phone. She sat a while at the kitchen table, the same table where the deed had first been spread out for Earl and Ed to see, where Gary had sat with his head in his hands the day he learned the plat was doomed, where the letter had finally surfaced from beneath a coffee tin's felt lining. She thought about how much of the last several months had happened at this one table, built by hands she could not remember, inherited along with everything else. She found herself, not for the first time, grateful in a way that went beyond the money or the land. Grateful simply that the table, the house around it, and the 40 acres beyond it had all still been there when she needed somewhere to stand. That November, the reading room hosted its first proper gathering. The children had started calling it that themselves, without any prompting from Dorothy at all. A Thanksgiving-adjacent afternoon. A dozen local families came up Hollow Creek Road with covered dishes and folding chairs, filling the front room and spilling out onto the porch, in a way the old farmhouse had not seen in decades. Not since Dorothy's own childhood, when her father had still hosted the whole county for harvest suppers, before age and grief had quieted the place down to almost nothing. Sandra came early to help set up, bringing her own mother this time, a soft-spoken woman named Louise who approached Dorothy near the coffee urn with visible nervousness. "I want to apologise," Louise said without preamble, "for something that happened before either of us was born. I know that probably sounds strange." "It doesn't," Dorothy said. "I understand exactly what you mean. My grandmother used to say the Kesslers stole that land from us," Louise said. "I grew up believing it, the way you believe things your family tells you before you're old enough to ask for the paperwork. I looked at the case file myself after Sandra told me what happened. My great-grandfather was in the wrong, Mrs. Kessler. Plainly, legally, thoroughly in the wrong. I'm sorry it took 3 generations and a lawsuit for somebody in my family to finally say that honestly." Dorothy reached out and took the other woman's hand, an old habit from 30 years of comforting frightened second graders on their first day of school, a gesture that translated well, she found, to comforting a grown woman, one working through an inherited shame that was not, strictly speaking, hers to carry. "Your great-grandfather is not you," Dorothy said, "and this land isn't going anywhere. There's no reason your grandchildren and mine can't grow up thinking of this creek as somewhere they're always welcome, instead of somewhere their family lost something 100 years before they were born." Louise's eyes went bright. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The two women stood together by the coffee urn. Behind them, in the front room where a welded trunk once sat sealed for 76 years, a dozen children argued cheerfully over which chapter of which book Dorothy ought to read next. By the time the afternoon wound down, the covered dishes were portioned into containers for people to take home. Dorothy stood on the porch with Gary beside her, watching Sandra and Louise load the car, watching Earl and Ed deep in some argument about whether the creek really did freeze earlier some years than others, watching the last of the neighbourhood children chase each other across the yard in the fading November light. "I used to think inheriting something meant somebody handed you a number," Gary said quietly. "A dollar figure. A deed. I don't think that anymore." "What do you think it means now?" Dorothy asked. Gary was quiet a moment, watching the yard, the porch, his mother beside him. The whole slow, ordinary scene of a family finding its way back towards something like wholeness. "I think it means somebody trusted you with something they built," he said finally, "and it's on you to figure out, sometimes the hard way, what it actually was." Dorothy did not say anything to that. She simply reached over and took her son's hand, the way she had not done since he was a boy small enough to need it. The two of them stood together on the porch a while longer, watching the light go gold, then grey, over the land her father had fought for, sealed away, and finally 76 years later, handed back whole. Spring came to Hollow Creek Road the way it always had, unhurried, the creek running high with snowmelt, the back 40 going green in patches Dorothy had never had the leisure to notice before, too busy in years past teaching other people's children. Not enough time to watch her own family's land change with the seasons. She had by then settled into a rhythm that felt less like recovery and more like simply living, which she supposed was the whole point of the last several months, though she had not fully understood that at the time. She rose early and made coffee on a stove that finally worked properly. Spent an hour, most mornings on the front porch with her notebook. Not because there was anything urgent left to track, just because 75 years of habit did not disappear the moment the crisis that sharpened it had passed. Gary came up most Sundays now, sometimes with Sandra, sometimes alone. The visits had settled into something Dorothy could not have predicted 6 months earlier. Not warm exactly, not yet, but honest in a way their relationship had not managed to be in years. He asked about the well pump. He asked about Earl's knees. Once, in April, he brought a folding chair. He sat with her on the porch for 2 full hours, without once mentioning money, subdivisions, or loans. Dorothy counted that privately, as one of the finer afternoons of the whole ordeal. "I keep thinking about Grandpa's letter," Gary said, "that April afternoon, turning his coffee cup the way he always did when he was working up to something. The part about land remembering who fought for it. I used to think that was just old man talk, something Grandpa said because he liked sounding wise." "I thought the same thing my whole childhood," Dorothy admitted. "Do you still think that?" "No," Dorothy said. "I think he meant exactly what he said. Land doesn't forget. People do. That's the whole trouble with families, Gary. We forget things land never lets go of. A grudge, a debt, a promise. It sits in the dirt, patient, waiting for somebody careless enough to walk over it, without checking what's underneath." Gary was quiet a long moment. "Sandra wants to bring her mother up here sometime," he said finally. "Meet you properly. I think she's been carrying some shame about the Aldean side of things that isn't really hers to carry. 3 generations removed and all. I think meeting you might help with that." "Tell her she's welcome any time," Dorothy said. She meant it. Whatever old grievance had briefly threatened to swallow her son's marriage whole, Dorothy had decided something. The surest way to finally bury it, properly this time, in daylight rather than under a welded lid, was simply to let the people carrying it meet each other, as themselves, rather than as the ghosts of a lawsuit 76 years gone. The developer's collapse rippled through Piney Fork and Elkton, both for most of the spring, the way these things do, in a small county, where everyone eventually hears everyone else's business, whether they mean to or not. Russ Tomlin's firm quietly folded 2 other pending projects elsewhere in the county. Projects that, upon closer inspection by nervous title attorneys suddenly very interested in double-checking their surveys, turned out to have their own smaller irregularities. Nothing on the scale of the Kessler case, but enough that Tomlin's name stopped appearing on new filings altogether by early summer. The 11 families who had put deposits down on Hollow Creek Estates lots eventually got their money back. All of it, after a drawn-out process that took most of the winter. It involved, according to Marjorie, no small amount of unhappy phone calls to the county planning office. Dorothy felt a genuine private relief at that news when it finally came through. Whatever her fight had been about, it had never been about hurting 11 families. Families who had simply wanted a nice lot to build a house on, who had trusted a plat that turned out to be drawn on sand. Earl Voss's boundary walk became, in its own small way, local legend. The kind of story that got told and slightly embellished at the diner counter for years afterward. The old surveyor and his borrowed metal detector, who found 30 feet of daylight between a subdivision's dream and a courthouse's paper. He came up to the farmhouse most Saturdays still. In June, at 82 years old, he finally let Dorothy talk him into teaching a free surveying class at the county extension office, passing along, as he put it, the only thing I ever knew that turned out to matter. Ed Tanner kept bringing eggs. Some habits, Dorothy had come to understand, did not need a reason. They simply were the shape a good neighbour's love took. Delivered weekly, expecting nothing back but a cup of coffee and a little conversation on the porch. By midsummer, Dorothy had turned the front room into something she had not planned. The one where the trunk sat empty and open, beneath her father's framed letter and the photograph of herself at 7 years old. But which felt, once it happened, entirely inevitable. She began inviting the handful of local children whose parents worked the same rural routes her own father once worked. They came sit on Saturday mornings while she read to them, the way she had once read to a room full of second graders in Piney Fork. She used her own small pension for it, and now the modest income from a properly documented land lease on the timber acreage. To buy books nobody in those families could easily afford otherwise. She called it nothing official. No sign on the gate, no name on a programme. It was simply Dorothy Kessler, 75 years old, sitting on her father's porch on Saturday mornings. A handful of children gathered around her, reading aloud from books bought with money that had once been sealed in a welded steel trunk for 76 years, waiting for exactly this kind of ordinary, patient use. You know, Ed said to her one Saturday morning in July. He was watching from the porch steps as she finished a chapter, sending 6 children off toward the creek to hunt for crawdads. Your daddy built that reading room without knowing it, sealed up a little bit of himself in that trunk, and here it is coming back out as this. Dorothy considered that, watching the children scatter down toward the water, laughing, careless in the particular way only children with nothing yet to fear could be. "I think you might be right, Ed," she said. "I think that's exactly what he meant, all those years ago, about the land being for keeping, not keeping it locked away, keeping it for something worth passing on." In August, the county finally finished its corrected survey of the entire Kessler boundary, resolving the last of the paperwork that had trailed behind the hearing for months. Dorothy drove into Elkton one final time to file the last of it with Desmond Farr, the patient young records clerk who had first found the buried probate line that started the whole unravelling. "You know," Desmond said, stamping the final page, "I've worked in that records annex 3 years now. Most days it's the quietest job in the building. I never expected to find something that actually changed anybody's life." "You changed mine," Dorothy said. "Don't ever think old paper doesn't matter, Desmond. It's the only thing in this world that remembers exactly what happened, long after everybody else has decided to forget." Earl's surveying class at the county extension office filled its first session within 2 days. 22 names on a list meant for 12. Earl called Dorothy that same evening, more excited than she had heard him sound in years. "Had to turn people away," he said. 22 names, Dorothy, for a class on reading old plat maps by hand. Half of them are kids who've never held a real compass, just grown up on GPS units that tell them where a line is without ever teaching them why. "You'll teach them why," Dorothy said. "I intend to," Earl said, "and I intend to use your daddy's old case as the first lesson." 1948. A boundary dispute, a deed that outlasted 3 generations of forgetting. Best teaching example I've had in my whole career, and it happened to be sitting under my own nose the whole time. Dorothy laughed at that. An easy laugh, the kind that came more readily to her now than it had in the anxious weeks before the hearing. "Just don't use our names," she said. "I don't need to be a lesson plan." "Too late," Earl said, though not unkindly. "This county's going to be telling the Kessler Cellar story for the next 50 years. Whether either of us likes it or not, might as well let it teach somebody something useful while it's at it." She thought about that after they hung up, standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the back 40 in the last of the summer light. She decided on balance that her father would not have minded. He had, after all, built the whole thing to be found eventually, by someone who needed exactly what it held. If a room full of teenagers learning to read a boundary line properly counted as one more generation carrying the lesson forward, so be it. That was simply the land doing, in its own patient way, precisely what her father always said it would. September brought the first real cool nights of the year, the kind that made Dorothy build a small fire in the wood stove in the evenings, more for the company of the light than any real need for heat. It was on one of those evenings that Gary called. He asked if he and Sandra could come up for supper, just the 3 of them, no lawyers, no ledgers, nothing left to settle. Dorothy said yes before he finished asking. They arrived a little after 6, Sandra carrying a casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel, the kind of gesture Dorothy remembered from her own mother's generation, an offering that meant more than the recipe inside it ever could. Gary carried a bag of apples from the orchard, 2 towns over. For a moment, watching her son and his wife come up the porch steps together, Dorothy allowed herself a small luxury, simply being glad to see them, without calculating anything else underneath it. Supper was easy, in a way none of their meals had been in years. Easy the way old habits are easy, once the newer, harder ones finally wear off. Sandra asked about the reading room, the Saturday mornings with the neighbourhood children. She seemed genuinely moved when Dorothy described watching a shy 7-year-old girl from down the road finish her first whole book 2 weeks earlier. Out loud, on the very porch where Dorothy herself had once learned her letters, at her own father's knee. "I want to help," Sandra said somewhat abruptly, halfway through the meal. "With the reading thing, I used to want to be a teacher." Before real estate happened. I could come Saturdays if you'd have me. Dorothy looked at her daughter-in-law across the table, at the woman whose own great-grandfather had once sued Walter Kessler over this same ground, and lost, whose family had apparently carried that old defeat quietly for 3 generations, without ever fully naming it. She felt something settle in her chest that she had not expected to feel again. Not after everything the last several months had cost all 3 of them. I would have you, Dorothy said. Every Saturday you can manage. After supper, while Sandra and Gary washed dishes together in the kitchen, easy and unhurried, Dorothy walked out onto the porch, alone, into the cool September evening. She looked out at the back 40 in the last of the light, the creek a dark ribbon at the far edge of it. The same fence line her father had shown her 70 years earlier from this exact spot. She thought about the trunk still sitting empty and open in the front room, WK-48 stamped faint into its corner. She thought about the letter, framed now beside the photograph of herself at 7 years old, her father's hand steady on her shoulder. She thought about Rufus Aldine, 3 generations gone, about a grudge that had travelled so far, so quietly, it had nearly cost her son everything, before finally, in a courtroom on a cold morning, running out of road. Mostly, though, she thought about her father, a dairy farmer who never finished high school, but who understood, better than any lawyer Dorothy had since paid for advice, that the truest inheritance a person could leave behind was not money, was not even land exactly. It was patience, the willingness to bury a thing carefully enough and wait long enough that it would still be there, whole and true, whenever the family that needed it most finally came looking. She'd spent 75 years believing the house on Larkspur Street was the whole of what she had built in this life. The marriage, the classroom, the raising of one difficult, beloved son. She understood now that the house had only ever been the visible half of the inheritance. The other half had been waiting the entire time, patient and dry, behind an iron door, 76 years shut, in a room her father built with his own 2 hands, for no other reason than love, expressed the only way a quiet man like Walter Kessler had ever fully known how to express it. The house is for living in, she thought, standing on the porch in the last light, looking out over the land her father had fought for and sealed away, and finally 76 years later, given back. The land is for keeping. She understood it now, all the way through, the way you only understand a thing once you have carried it yourself. Behind her through the screen door, Gary laughed quietly at something Sandra had said. Dishes clinked. Water ran. Ahead of her, the back 40 settled into full dark. One late firefly rose slow over the grass. Along the fence line her father once walked with her hand in his. Dorothy watched it a moment longer, then went back inside to the warm kitchen and the sound of her family's voices.